It's always good fun watching a Tory minister resign. That's until you find out who has replaced them. Yes, Matt Hancock has been replaced by Sajid Javid, a lockdown skeptic and an Ayn Rand obsessive. We really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Tonight, we are also going to be discussing, the fallout from Matt Hancock's resignation, including the pressure on Boris Johnson. Why didn't he make the decision himself? And the speculation over why there was a CCTV, why there was CCTV footage of Matt Hancock kissing his aide and how it got leaked. And we have an update on COVID for you. There were 23,000 new cases reported today. So that's a very worrying statistic. Although, as we'll be discussing, all is not lost because hospitalizations aren't rising to the same degree. As always, let us know your thoughts by tweeting on the hashtag #TyskySour. And if you're new, hit that subscribe button. First story. Who is Sajid Javid and how will he manage the country's health? Well, there are two big issues that fall into two big categories when it comes to the responsibilities that will fall to the new health secretary. The first is obviously the pandemic. How will he manage coronavirus? And the second is everything else. So let's talk about the pandemic first. Now, as we've discussed over the past year and a half, a big divide in Westminster when it comes to COVID-19 is whether or not MPs and politicians are doves or hawks. Now, if you're a dove, what you believe is that health should take priority over the economy. You're willing to bring in restrictions earlier rather than later, and you never wanted to, I suppose, run the economy hot, which essentially means, have a bit of a herd immunity strategy. The hawks are the opposite of the doves, clearly. So they're like, let's avoid restrictions, let's avoid lockdowns at all costs. We should just treat this a bit more like the flu. We should balance out these different interests. Now, I've often critiqued that dichotomy on this show before, but here, for now, let's just use this framework because it is one that exists among MPs. Now, on this spectrum, Matt Hancock was a dove. He was someone who was often, as health secretary, pushing for restrictions to come earlier rather than later against people like Rishi Sunak, against people like Boris Johnson. According to the reports in the newspapers these past 2 days, Javid is very much a hawk. So Matt Hancock has been replaced by someone who is much less keen on restrictions or much less willing to impose restrictions than Matt Hancock was. In the Eye, Katie Balls, who is well connected in Tory circles, suggested that with Hancock abandoned, Sajid Javid is likely to lead the government on a less cautious pandemic route. In that article, she says that on being appointed to the role, Javid said his most immediate priority would be to return to normal as quickly as possible. In previous comments, Javid has sided with the cabinet hawks in the lockdown debate. Last spring, he said the government should run the economy hot and lift restrictions to encourage growth. It follows that senior Tories believe his appointment could tip the inner cabinet balance on COVID decisions in favour of a faster easing and fewer restrictions. That's the take from Katie Balls. Camilla Tominey in The Telegraph spoke to a source who went further than that. So the source told Camilla Tominey, he's a real lockdown skeptic. He's convinced that in a few years' time, with the economic costs so high, everyone will be thinking, why the hell did we do that? The tilt in the cabinet has just shifted quite considerably. So this is someone who thinks not only do we want to avoid restrictions now, but we should never have had a lockdown last winter. Now, virtually all epidemiologists think this is a terrible argument. It was tried in Sweden where they didn't have a lockdown. What it ended up having was much more deaths than comparable countries and their neighbors, and such a bigger hit to the economy. So this is bad science. It's bad policy. Will it, though, affect, I suppose, our COVID response at this point in time? Now everyone really admits we don't want to have lockdowns. Or will this change in tone have some effect? Let's take a look at his first intervention as health secretary, which was this afternoon in the House of Commons.
Now, I spent my first day as health secretary just yesterday looking at the data and testing it to the limit. Whilst we decided not to bring forward step 4, we see no reason to go beyond the 19th of July. Because, in truth, No date we choose comes with zero risk for COVID. We know we cannot simply eliminate it. We have to learn to live with it. We also know that people and businesses need certainty, so we want every step to be irreversible. And make no mistake, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the restrictions on our freedoms, they must come to an end. We owe it to the British people, who have sacrificed so much to restore their freedoms as quickly as we possibly can, and not to wait a moment longer than we need to.
I mean, in a way, no one can disagree with that. Why would we want to wait a moment longer than we need to? But there were some elements of that speech which were, I suppose, quite a sharp breach with how Matt Hancock sometimes spoke about this. So what we'd often hear when Matt Hancock was Health Secretary was that we're going to work from data, not dates. Sajid Javid is taking the opposite approach, which is to say that dates actually have to be fairly absolute. He was saying businesses need certainty. That means when I say we're going to unlock on the 19th of July, we will unlock on the 19th of July. I say unlock. We will remove all restrictions on the 19th of July, and we will not be going backwards. So you can see how those are the words of someone who is more skeptical of restrictions than his predecessor. Now, Ash, I want your take on this, specifically on how he will relate to the pandemic, or how Sajid Javid's appointment could change government policy when it comes to pandemic control. Because on the one hand, I mean, from my perspective, he's had views and perspectives which have been thoroughly proven wrong over the past year and a half. At the same time, we are now at a position where kind of everyone agrees we want to ultimately be removing as many restrictions as possible. So maybe having him as Health Secretary a year ago would have been terrible. But right now, when it comes to the pandemic and issues about lockdowns or otherwise, is it almost irrelevant?
So this is an interesting one, because Sajid Javid, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, was obviously something of a deficit hawk. And when Rishi Sunak eventually replaced him, lots of people, including myself, went, well, it's going to be more of the same, if not, a bit more pro-austerity. And then Sunak kind of surprised everyone by being a bit more amenable when it came to borrowing and turning on the spending taps. Obviously, lots of that money was siphoned off in the form of lucrative public sector contracts for private sector interests. But it was one of the ways in which Sunak was something of a surprise. And I think that Sajid Javid, when you sort of compare him to other figures in the cabinet, he's a lot more rigid, a lot less flexible. So I think when he's saying, I am something of, an anti-lockdown voice, I'm going to be hard and absolutist on dates, it's going to be very difficult to get him to shift from that position. Now, it's not quite as disastrous as it would have been to have had a health secretary either earlier in the winter or last spring with that point of view. That would have resulted in even more deaths than what we have tragically had to endure. But that would have been completely catastrophic. Here, with the vaccine in play, I think it's merely troubling, right? Because you're not necessarily going to see the same level of disaster as you did when you had the virus just running through society uninterrupted, and you also had no means by which to protect people from it, apart from lockdown, social distancing, and the kinds of restrictions we've been living with for over a year. So what worries me isn't necessarily that we're going to see under Sajid Javid a huge increase in deaths. It's going to be that we see some increase in deaths, a slightly bigger increase in hospitalizations. And while we're still waiting for, many young people to be vaccinated, higher rates of long COVID, because you've got a health secretary who is so wedded to the very letter of the dates that he refuses to budge on them one bit. And what we've seen, I think, when it comes to the Delta variant, is that there is a need to respond very quickly to new and emerging variants, to where they happen to be transmitting initially when they reach this country, and someone who's not afraid to say, well, actually, maybe we need some restrictions in these localities. If Sajid Javid's saying, I'm not going to be that guy, well, that is worrying, because what that could mean is actually much greater restrictions on all of us and all the things that we like to do much later down the line, when people have suffered a lot more in the lead up to that.
I mean, I suppose the thing that I found a little bit worrying about it was that I mean, you would like to think that the health sector, if you think of government sometimes as, people bargaining from their different perspectives, and then you come to some compromise. So if there is some trade-off between COVID and the economy, then it kind of makes sense that you've got a chancellor who comes into the room and says, my priority is the economy. Then you've got a health secretary who comes and says, my priority is health. And then they bash it out and come to some sort of compromise. What it seems like at the moment is we're going to have a health secretary going into the room who's like, my priority is business. The chancellor who goes into the room and says, my priority is business. And who are the people advocating for our health? That's what I'm slightly worried about here, even though, as I say, I mean, none of us want to go back into a lockdown. We'll talk in more detail later about what the vaccination drive does mean when it comes to all of these questions. For now, though, I do want to move on from the pandemic and talk about, well, everything else, because it is a pretty significant time to become health secretary. There are some big decisions coming up. They include what will the social care reforms be? Boris Johnson has talked about bringing in a new system to replace the completely failing one that we have. There are some issues about how much that will cost. Boris Johnson, apparently, we're told, wants to spend a significant amount of money on that to help implement the Deal Not reforms, which would have a cap on the amount that you can spend on care. People like Rishi Sunak saying, no way we can afford this. Let's keep doing care on the cheap as we do now. So Sajid Javid will have a role there. The other issue is obviously how the NHS rebuilds after the pandemic. It's going to be a real, I suppose, a critical juncture, I suppose you could say, with the NHS. They're going to have to rebuild, and there is a moment now where you'll have all of the neoliberals say, well, for us to be able to rebuild this, we've got to privatize and sell our stuff. We've got to cut corners so that we can get rid of all of these waiting lists. And then you're going to have other people saying, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that we need to properly invest in our health service. We need to increase the funding of it by a significant degree. I mean, at the moment, I think we spend about 10% on the NHS. It's very low compared to other countries. I'd be saying, let's put it up to 11, 12, 13%. Is Sajid Javid the kind of guy who'd be making that argument? Let's stick with the first one. So on care, there are two big arguments here, or two popular arguments I've seen today as to what role Sajid Javid would have when it comes to whether or not we will properly fund care when these reforms come about. Probably the dominant argument is Sajid Javid is a fiscal hawk. He'll basically side with Rishi Sunak, which is to say, no, we can't afford to have a proper, decent social care system. We're going to have to continue doing it on the cheap. The other opposing argument is to say, actually, because he is health secretary, he will end up arguing for a decent social care system. And because he was chancellor, he'll be in a position to win that argument. You can decide which of those you find more plausible. First of all, though, I do want to show you a third possible option. This was from Camilla Tominey. She suggested, or her source, in fact, suggested he would just kick the can down the road. So Camilla Tominey quoted a former colleague of Javid who said, while there is no doubt Sajid will look to do a number of far-reaching reforms, I think he's of the opinion we are at completely the wrong stage of the parliament now to suddenly launch a new social care strategy. He thinks the Tories need another election victory, so they've got another 4 or 5 year term to do it properly. So we've got there a health secretary whose priority is business instead of health, and a health secretary whose priority is Tories winning. Now on to whether or not he'll defend the NHS. What kind of position does he have when it comes to a publicly funded, strong NHS? Here again, some serious causes for concern. Chris Smith in The Times writes, Javid made his name as a Thatcherite small state conservative. Twice a year, he rereads Ayn Rand's Pay into the Power of the Individual against an overmighty state. So this is a real ideological neoliberal, someone who's committed back to paring back the reaches of the state. Now, to have someone like that in charge of the NHS, not necessarily what we want to see. Another thing we know about Sajid Javid is that last summer he was hired by JP Morgan as a senior advisor. So this isn't his career before politics, it's his career whilst being an MP. Now, this is potentially worrying because the Mirror have described JP Morgan as a major player in private healthcare, and Zara Sultana, a Labour left MP, summarised well precisely why this should be of concern for us all. So she tweeted, the new health secretary, Sajid Javid, earns £150,000 as an advisor to US bank JP Morgan. JP Morgan say they see the opportunities that lie ahead for private healthcare. The ultimate opportunity for private healthcare is NHS privatisation. The NHS isn't safe with the Tories. Now, that quote about seeing opportunities in healthcare is from the JP Morgan website. So they're very clear about this. On this issue of Sajid Javid's relationship to the NHS, his broader politics and what that will mean for his role, Ash, how worried do you think we should be?
I mean, I was just listening to you describe the fact that you've got a sitting MP, a former chancellor, and now a present health secretary who, as his little, job on the side for a bit of pin money, is advising JP Morgan, and you've just got to laugh at that point, don't you? Britain has an image of itself of not only being above such, horrible tawdry things like corruption, which only happen in those brown people countries, don't you know? But, we're the home of the mother of parliaments. We invented this constitutionalism game, playing fair and by the rules. And then you have a look at the rules and they just may as well not fucking exist. They just may as well not exist. It's such a clear conflict of interest to have, a former chancellor being paid by a huge investment bank. And also part of that money isn't actually for the advice that he gives. It's also in the hope that he's going to make his way back into power and back into cabinet at some point. And then you've got JP Morgan with a direct ear to the heart of government. It turns out you can put a price on power. It's 150 grand a year. So that was the thing that I was thinking while listening to that. It just reminded me of how disingenuous a lot of the brouhaha around the Lex Greensill scandal was. Because if people wanted this kind of thing not to happen, the rules would be different. And they're drafted this way for a reason. But as for how worried we should be about Sajid Javid being health secretary, I would say very. He is an ideological neoliberal and Thatcherite. As you said, he rereads Ayn Rand twice a year. I think when you also look at what he said before in terms of what he thinks an ideal state and should be like, how it should be run, he always was that bit more distant even from the kind of, Dominic Cummings vision where you have, high spend, low tax, deregulate. He wants, low spend, low tax overall. That's what he thinks the most efficient and ideal kind of state is. And when you look at the kinds of problems this country is facing, the two major ones are, of course, climate change and then, elderly care. Those are two things which cannot be fixed without huge amounts of money being poured into them. When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, some of the money which was earmarked for climate change was absolutely insulting. It was, risible, quite frankly. And I think now as Health Secretary, you're going to see lots of, big trumpeted announcements of, spending and cash, which ultimately are tiny drops in the ocean for what it needs that needs to be done to reform our healthcare service. I wonder what's going to happen though, and this is a kind of side point, is that one of the things that Matt Hancock was working on was a reversal of some aspects of the Lansley reforms of the NHS to try and put more powers back in the hands of the health secretary. So I wonder if that's something that Sajid Javid will continue with, just from a purely, governance perspective, or if he's quite happy seeing the NHS balkanized, unable to coordinate effectively. It was those Lansley reforms which in part made us so vulnerable to the pandemic in the first place.
I mean, I've read a few profiles of Sajid Javid today because obviously, all the newspapers are doing them. And the thing that's actually stood out most to me is none of them mention health. Like the guy doesn't seem to have expressed any opinions about healthcare or social care before. Everything about him is he's interested in finance capital. He's interested in cutting the deficit. He's interested in lowering taxes. I haven't read anywhere where it seems like, this is a guy who has a passion for healthcare. I haven't read that anywhere. And to be honest, I do find that quite worrying. Why not put someone in charge of the NHS who knows what they're talking about? Someone who used to work in the NHS, someone who has a passion for this kind of stuff. You've put in there someone who, it just seems like you've just thrown them in a random job because Boris Johnson wanted to bring him back onto the front bench. In terms of why he did come back onto the front bench. Let's go to one commentary on his appointment that we couldn't really ignore. It's Dominic Cummings, and he tweeted after the announcement, "So Carrie appoints Sarge. Note, if I hadn't tricked the Prime Minister into firing Sajid, we'd have had a Treasury with a useless Secretary of State and special advisors, no furlough scheme, total chaos instead of a joint number 10, number 11 team, which was a big success. Sajid equals bog standard, equals chasing headlines, plus failing equals awful for the NHS. Need hashtag regime change." He's got this very boomer energy doing a hashtag regime. Like, that's not a hashtag, but anyway. Ash, how seriously do you think we should take that commentary from Dominic Cummings? I suppose he's saying the only reason he was pointing was because he's an ally of Carrie Simons, who's obviously an enemy of Dominic Cummings, but also he's saying this guy's just useless.
Well, I mean, look, when Dominic Cummings is talking about regime change, who is he talking about? He's talking about Michael Gove and he's talking about Rishi Sunak, all right? So while he might have some juicy tidbits, and of course he had a lot of juicy tidbits about Matt Hancock when he was at that select committee, and all but saying that he demanded 15 times to have the health secretary fired out of a cannon from the top of the Palace of Westminster. While he's able to add colour and detail to lots of things that perhaps we already knew about some of the major figures of government, I think that the fundamental aspects of his analysis of, why is Sunak better than Sajid Javid, it's motivated by factionalism and sort of petty empire building. I don't think it's particularly astute or accurate, but something which is important here, and this goes back to answering your question, Michael, well, why has this guy who has never articulated even the slightest bit of interest in healthcare suddenly found himself as health secretary, while we're still in a pandemic and we're facing these huge existential health crises as a nation? Why not promote somebody who's already a junior minister, who's familiar with the pandemic response? Well, it's because if you're Boris Johnson and you've essentially handed over a big scalp to your ex-babes Dominic Cummings, you've then got to signal, but you don't really win. And so that's why you bring someone back who was forced out by your ex-advisor. That's what I think the calculation was. And I do think that it was that petty.
And it is all basically point scoring and political management, right? Not any interest in our collective health. But I suppose we wouldn't have expected any more from Boris Johnson. We're going to move on from Sajid Javid for now. I'm sure we'll be coming back to him on many a future show. For now, we're going to talk about the fallout from Matt Hancock's resignation. It is still a political event which is having enormous reverberations. Matt Hancock's resignation was not the result of any decision by Boris Johnson. In fact, the Prime Minister had encouraged him to stay. And the initial defences of Matt Hancock have left the government open to accusations that they do believe there is one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. You might think that in most jobs, if you've broken the rules that you yourself have set, you'd be fired. Not so if you are in Boris Johnson's cabinet. You get to decide yourself whether or not you will leave. Now, the argument that the government, does seem to believe there is one rule for everyone else and one rule for them was put powerfully by Trevor Phillips on Sky on Sunday. He was speaking to Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis.
So, Lewis, I wouldn't normally do something like this, but I want to put a private, personal question, I guess, in a way to you. Over the past 2 days, every cabinet minister, including you, has come out to essentially defend the Prime Minister and Matt Hancock. The pictures that we saw were of an encounter on May the 6th. On May the 11th, my family buried my daughter, who had died not of COVID, but during the lockdown. 300 of our family and friends turned up online, but most of them were not allowed to be at the graveside, even though it was in the open air, because of the rule of 30, because of the instruction by Mr. Hancock. Now, the next time one of you tells me what to do in my private life, explain to me why I shouldn't just tell you where to get off.
But I absolutely accept and understand the frustration and even the anger that people have, having been through the situations they've been through. Look, as you say, Trevor, people across the country, I've lost friends whose funerals I've not been able to go to over the last period. That is such a tragic situation for any of us to be in. And that's, I have to say, why it's so important all of us do what we can to keep ourselves, our families, our friends, our wider community safe. It's also why that what Matt did was wrong. He acknowledged that. It's why he apologised immediately for his behaviour and acknowledged what he did was wrong. And it's ultimately why he's taken the decision that his position was untenable and distracting from the wider work that we've all got to do to move forward in the pandemic and out of the pandemic. There's no getting away from that. And I think that's why Matt ultimately made the decision he did. As I say, I think in doing that, he has put his family and indeed all of us across the UK first, because he wants to focus, as the PM does, as we all do, to be on getting out of this pandemic in the best possible way and as quickly as we can.
Now, that was a really extraordinary clip. I mean, Trevor Phillips there had put forward, a really upsetting, really moving story. He's saying very recently his daughter it was his daughter's funeral. By the way, she passed away from anorexia. That was after struggling for 2 decades with an eating disorder. I don't know exactly whether or not Trevor Phillips relates that to the lockdown, but I think the fact he sort of mentioned that was during lockdown seems that he does. And Brandon Lewis didn't even recognize that. He didn't say my condolences. He didn't recognize that this incredibly sad story had just been revealed to him, and he didn't show any solidarity. He just gave this completely boilerplate answer, which is to say, oh, I understand why some people are annoyed. I understand why some people are angry. I've also missed funerals. Like, it was such an incredibly inappropriate answer from someone who clearly has no emotional intelligence. What the clip did show as well is, I mean, why Matt Hancock had to go. Imagine if Brandon Lewis, like emotional, fool that he seems to be, was put out to defend Matt Hancock keeping his job. That would have been a nightmare for the government. One more thing to mention about that clip is the boilerplate answer ended with that Matt Hancock has put his family first by resigning and leaving his wife and kids to live with his mistress, which is slightly odd. Ash, I want to know what you make of that interview, but also what it says about Boris Johnson, that he was ready to defend Matt Hancock. So if Boris Johnson had his way, this would have just been Dominic Cummings, Barnard Castle, Mark II. Matt Hancock did what any good man would do, which is snog his mistress in his office and then leave his wife and kids.
I mean, look, I think you had it bang on when you identified the fundamental lack of empathy and humanity in Brandon Lewis's response. Because when somebody is telling you, I lost my daughter during this pandemic, the response cannot be, well, I've also lost friends. These two things are not equivalent. A parent burying their child and you not attending the funeral of a friend are just completely different orders of magnitude. It's just different kinds of grief. You just can't do that. And I think just the decent way to address that question is go, my condolences. I'm so sorry. That pain that you feel has been echoed across the country, and that's why Matt Hancock staying in place was untenable. Right? That's it. That's all that needs to be said, because that's what the truth is. But you had that kind of I think sometimes the media training of politicians where like, give an answer, give as much detail as possible, and it'll make you look authoritative and like you're not ducking it. It's just actually reeks in some settings as just, disingenuous and slimy and inhumane. And that's how Brandon Lewis comes across there. But moving on to, well, why is it Boris Johnson didn't sack Hancock right away? Because really it should be a no-brainer that if you, as a powerful politician, are having an affair with somebody who is receiving public money, that you should sack that person. But if you yourself have done that as a politician like Boris Johnson has, how are you going to sack anybody else for it? Really, you should be like, oh, well. Like, what can you say? You can say nothing. So I think that was the first problem, which is, how can Boris Johnson sack somebody for doing exactly what he's done in the past? He can't. The second thing is the instinct with this government is no resignations, no sackings, unless or until you've done something to upset me or my now wife personally, or if you're a useful fall guy and a patsy. And I think at this point, Matt Hancock didn't really fit either of those two models. The problem is that the story just looked like it was going to go on and on. So you had the stills and then you had the video with the ass grab, you know. Then what you're going to have is, you know, potentially a police investigation. Then after that, people are going to be looking into what are the circumstances of her having been hired in the first place. What kind of access did she have to high level confidential meetings with civil servants or in Downing Street? What kind of say did she have over decisions within the Department of Health, or what kind of influence did she have where she or her clients, the clients of the lobbying firm for which she is a director, stood to benefit? So it's something which I think was just not going to be contained. It wasn't a case of this is a scandal, it will happen, it will blow up, you sit tight, you weather it. I think it was going to roll on and on and on. And I think once that became clear, it was obvious to Boris Johnson that he couldn't spend the political capital on this. And also perhaps he didn't like Matt Hancock enough to do so, right? We know that he thinks he's fucking useless. So yeah, that's why I think he didn't and why he eventually did.
I mean, there was clearly a thing with Dominic Cummings whereby I suppose Dominic Cummings didn't want to go, but also Boris Johnson seemed to think he was completely dependent on him, that he couldn't really function in government without his chief advisor, because Boris Johnson doesn't actually like doing any work. And it seems he didn't feel the same way about Matt Hancock. What does seem to be clear, though, is that, you know, a cynic in these situations would say, yes, Matt Hancock's resigned, but he's only resigned so that he can return to frontline politics in 3 months' time. This isn't really going to be, you know, a real consequence for the guy. This is media management, and he can come into an equally senior role in the near future, even though he's done something which so many people in the public find so offensive, like as Trevor Phillips put there. But I mean, you don't need to be a cynic to think that, because actually Boris Johnson has been fairly explicit that that is what is going to happen in this particular circumstance. So in the letter Boris Johnson sent to Matt Hancock accepting his resignation, he included the following. You should leave office very proud of what you have achieved, not just in tackling the pandemic, but even before COVID-19. You should be immensely proud of your service. I am grateful for your support and believe that your contribution to public service is far from over. So, I mean, that's really strange, isn't it, Ash? I mean, Boris Johnson is explicitly saying, yep, okay, yeah, you can resign now, fine, go for it. I'll just appoint you in 6 months' time.
Well, yeah, that is it's not even subtext, is it? It's just text.
It's very explicit, yeah.
It's just regular text. Yeah, no, I think that's what's in there. It's I don't like you enough to take the slings and arrows now, but yeah, you're an ally. You can come back. That's what I want, you know. And Matt Hancock isn't an astonishingly talented politician. All right, you don't look at him and you go, you know, well, there goes a big beast. He's somebody who has always had, I think, this aura of pathetic thirst around him. That was just the thing which I would think when I saw him on TV. I was like, even before this stuff about Gina Coladangelo came out, you're just like, oof, that man is starving. But I think that, you know, excellence and diligence aren't things that Boris Johnson looks for in a cabinet minister. I think it's personal loyalty and a willingness to take the flak when Boris Johnson doesn't want to sully his own optimistic image. And that's why we'd often see Matt Hancock, you know, breaking the bad news and Boris Johnson going, I don't want to take this one. To lots of tricky press conferences that Matt Hancock was kind of shunted in front of the cameras for. You have to reward that kind of loyalty or lack of dignity, whatever way you want to put it.
I mean, those are probably the two key talents of Matt Hancock in the job, wasn't it? I mean, from Boris Johnson's perspective, which was he was willing to take the flak for him, go out in front of the cameras and take whatever criticisms the media were throwing at that point in time, and also lie on his behalf. If you're Boris Johnson, it's really handy to have ministers who have no moral qualms or whatsoever about saying things that everyone categorically can see are untrue. Because if that's what you need, Matt Hancock will do it. He is your guy. We are going to go on to one more Matt Hancock story, again, potentially relating to his honesty. You can read into it what you want. We learned some more details over the weekend about the more personal consequences of the Sun splashing a photo of Matt Hancock snogging his aide. Part of that is that Hancock, as well as leaving his job, has left his family. The Sunday Times report that Hancock told his wife he was leaving her on Thursday evening immediately after he learnt his affair was about to be exposed. He even woke up their youngest child, aged 8, to break the news. Martha Hancock had had no idea her husband was cheating on her with his university friend and had considered their marriage happy and stable. Now, Matt Hancock left his wife to be with his now former aide, who also left her husband over the weekend. Both parties had 3 children. Now, sources quoted in the papers all agree that this is now a serious relationship between Matt Hancock and Gina Coladangelo. They are saying, so a friend is quoted in the Mail on Sunday describing them as a, quote, love match. However, there are conflicting accounts as to how long they've been together. So according to the Sunday Times, insiders believe the affair had been going on for months by the time the covert video was recorded on May the 6th. That has been contradicted in the Mail on Sunday. They quoted friends who said they'd only been seeing each other for 6 weeks. Now, the timing here matters not just for the sake of, it's interesting how long have they been together, how long has the affair been going on, but it also has some quite serious political ramifications, because if they've been together for a long time, then it's quite possible that when Matt Hancock appointed Coladangelo to be a non-executive director of the Department of Health, they were already in a relationship. If they've only been together for 6 weeks, then obviously, that wouldn't be the case. They were already close friends. So in any case, it probably should have been declared, but it's obviously clearly more serious if they are in a romantic relationship, and it was not declared. It's going to be difficult for us here and now to decide which one is true. You might think, though, that if you have left your wife and kids in the case of Matt Hancock, or left your husband and kids in the case of Coladangelo, that would be a surprising thing to do if you've only been together for 6 weeks. So it's potentially more plausible that they have been together for a long time, which would raise the question of, were they in a relationship when she was appointed to this well-paid and very significant role? Worth also saying that in any case, the simple fact Matt Hancock has left his wife to set up a life with his former aide has apparently annoyed local Conservatives so much that insiders believe he could get deselected by West Suffolk members before the next general election. That was in the Times. To be honest, I'll believe that when I see it. Ash, I want your take on this, because some people might think, oh, you guys, you're dabbling in gossip. Why are you talking about Matt Hancock leaving his family? On many levels, though, the relationship between Matt Hancock and Coladangelo, and how serious it was, how long it has lasted, does have some serious political ramifications, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it does. And the first thing that I want to say is that people's personal lives are messy. All right. None of us would like it if you went digging through decisions we've made and, late night texts we've sent. Something embarrassing would be in there. All right. People are disgusting. That's just the way of the world. And so this isn't coming from a perspective of saying having an affair alone should disqualify you from high office, because I don't think that. But what I do think is the really critical thing here is, did the nature of their relationship mean that there wasn't the correct oversight in hiring her in the first place? Because she had her parliamentary pass not through Matt Hancock, but through Lord Bethel, through somebody else. There was no record of her appointment back in March. And then also you've got this question of what her role was as a non-executive board member at the Department of Health. It was to monitor and to scrutinize what was going on in the department. And that includes Matt Hancock himself. So one, that means that at any point, them having an affair means that she cannot be trusted to do the job that she is paid with taxpayers' money to do. And two, if the affair was going on before she was hired, and also before she had her role as an unpaid advisor to the Department of Health, well, then it means that there was deceit, that there was attempts to conceal the true nature of the hiring and why it might have been that Matt Hancock would have wanted her around. And also it would have concealed the fact that she cannot be trusted to do the jobs that she's brought in specifically to do. And then you've also got this business of, chumocracy, or as I just like to call it, corruption, more generally, that you can get these lucrative contracts if you've simply got the mobile phone number of Matt Hancock, or if you used to run a pub that he liked to go to. Gina Coladangelo's case, it's, well, maybe he fancied me since university. And here I am, I'm a director at, Luther Pendragon? Is that the lobbying firm? Who represent amongst their clients British Airways and Accenture, both who won contracts with the Department of Health during the pandemic. Is this again somebody who's got the right kind of relationship, who's in the personal good books of the health secretary, getting unfettered and improper access in order to essentially squeeze, a government department of taxpayer money so it can be funneled away to private interests, right? And that's why the affair matters. It's not just about, whether or not you consider somebody who has an affair beyond the pale. It's actually about what is concealed within that whole tawdry cloud.
Yeah, in terms of what Luther Pendragon do, The Guardian, in their description, say they specialize in crisis and reputation management. So
wow,
presumably she'll have a lot of work to do over the next couple of days.
Do you think she's going to invoice him for it?
Can you invoice for a problem you've caused? I suppose actually, I mean, that's
I do all
how
the time.
Politics works. That's how politics works normally. You cause a problem and then you tell the public that you can fix it. So interesting. She should. I mean, if she was very good at her job, she would have said, check your office for CCTV before you cop off with any of your colleagues in the middle of the pandemic.
Can I just say one thing, which is, I know I've just said that the really important things here are to do with how was she hired, where has the money gone, where was the oversight. But can you just give me just one little gossipy moment for a second? Because what struck me was that the husband of Gina Coladangelo was helping her put her bags in the car. And one of the things that you didn't see, I also think that it was really bad for photographers to be outside the family homes, but seeing as they was there and I saw, I did also come to some opinions, that you didn't see, the clothes being dumped out of the bedroom window, which is personally what I would have done. If I had just found out that not only had I been cheated on, that it was with Matt Hancock, the clothes would be going out the window. You'd be hearing Khalees caught out there being played at ear-splitting volume. I would want the press to know that, to paraphrase Richard Nixon, I am not a cuck.
Yeah, well, it did make, I don't know. I thought maybe it made him look like a gentleman, and maybe that's going to make it easier to find his next wife. But I thought maybe he was thinking 2 steps ahead. Probably a very intelligent. He's Oliver Bonas man, but he's not called Oliver Bonas. He's called Oliver. I don't know who the Bonas is. We're going to go on to a story about that CCTV camera, national security implications. Before we do that, if you are enjoying tonight's show, hit the like button. How did an image of Matt Hancock kissing an aide in his own office find its way to the front page of the Sun newspaper? Now, it's a crucial question for a number of reasons. Evidence of infidelity on the part of politicians can serve as compromat, can make them liable to blackmail. We might think that if you've got CCTV cameras that are taking pictures of ministers doing all sorts of embarrassing things, what could that be used for and who could use it? Affairs or otherwise, compromat or otherwise, we might think that there being recording devices in minister's office is potentially dangerous because classified information is being discussed. What else is being recorded, and is there more sensitive information which is being passed on? I mean, I would say that they could be leaking sensitive advice about who's getting contracts in the Department for Health, but it seems that none of that's that sensitive. You can just ask and he'll tell you all on WhatsApp anyway. But you can imagine hypothetically, if you had a more upstanding government, that could be a problem. Finally, it potentially raises questions about the press. Now, the splash, this image you can see there, was on the front page of The Sun. That's, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch. And the article, the investigation itself, was written by Harry Cole, who was the ex-boyfriend of the Prime Minister's wife. Right? So this is all, these are some real close connections here. And you might question whether it's fine that the ex-boyfriend of the Prime Minister's wife and a billionaire newspaper owner seem to have more control over whether or not ministers resign than, well, essentially anyone else. This is someone who oversaw 150,000 deaths. He managed to keep his job, even though he lied about a bunch of things, including testing going into care homes and the number of tests that were being done every day. He kept his job then. But the thing that made him lose it was an image on the front page of The Sun. Now, all of this means it is pretty relevant as to what were the sequence of events by which this image found its way onto the front page of The Sun. And there have been some pretty explosive answers proposed, in particular by allies of Matt Hancock. Now, they have suggested to various newspapers that he was a victim of a hit job by Number 10 or even a spying operation by China. And the reason they've been purporting that it could be something along these lines is that Matt Hancock had no idea there was CCTV in his office. Now, that meant it was speculated, including in the Times, that the images had been caught by a covert small camera that had been placed in a light fixture. So this would be very James Bond-esque, really, if it were the case. However, at least the question of how the camera found its way to be there seems to be a bit more mundane. It doesn't seem like it was the Chinese or the Russians fitting, or Boris Johnson himself fitting a tiny CCTV camera into a light. And that's because images printed in the Mail on Sunday show there was a CCTV camera in Hancock's office in 2017 when he moved in. So you can see this image here, and you can see there in the top right, there is a CCTV camera, the kind, it's in that sort of glass half a sphere where it can move around and you can't particularly tell where it's pointing. So it seems that Matt Hancock is maybe just not a very observant person. There's also a graphic in the Mail showing where the camera is and how it would have in fact been well placed to film the pair kissing at the door. So very interesting. I mean, I kind of would have preferred it to have been planted in a light by someone, but at least from this Mail story, it seems plausible that there was a CCTV camera already there. The Mail also had some details of how it came to pass that footage recorded on that CCTV camera ended up on the front page of a tabloid newspaper. And they say, so the Mail on Sunday say, it was recorded by a member of staff at the department who then contacted a prominent lockdown skeptic to try and get the images placed in a newspaper. So the Mail say, we don't know precisely how the Sun got it, but what we have seen is a series of messages to a prominent lockdown skeptic, which shows there was someone, an ordinary member of staff in the Department of Health, who wanted to get this story out to damage Matt Hancock. Let's go to some of the reportage in the Mail on Sunday. So they write, in a series of Instagram messages seen by this newspaper, the whistleblower says they need to be very careful with the information I'm about to share. They add, I have some very damning CCTV footage of someone that has been recently classed as effing hopeless. Now, that message was sent on the 17th of June, so that was the day after Dominic Cummings released the text messages which showed Boris Johnson had called Hancock hopeless. They also go on, the Mail goes on to say, on June the 19th, the whistleblower explains more about the footage, writing, I really need to be careful with this, but it involves him in a very compromising position with someone who isn't his wife last month. Later they reveal, I have the full video. It's now been deleted off the system as it's over 30 days old, I suppose. In a separate message, the whistleblower admits working for the Department of Health. Finally, the Daily Mail report, having sent a grab image from the video to the anti-lockdown figure, the whistleblower discussed a potential payment, but said they were not looking for a large amount. Asked for further material, they conclude, I really don't feel comfortable sending any more than I already have at the moment. It's a very interesting story in the Mail. I mean, I'm assuming what's happened here is that there is a prominent lockdown skeptic who is in contact with this journalist from the Mail on Sunday, and he says, look, it wasn't me that leaked this image to the Sun, but I can tell that there was someone who worked in the Department of Health who was trying to find a way to get this placed in a newspaper. And I know that because I was one of the people he reached out to. The Mail on Sunday say they've seen the messages, so they can vouch that this did happen. And there was someone in the Department of Health who was trying to get out these images, presumably because they were contacting a lockdown skeptic because they thought that Matt Hancock had been too pro-lockdown, too pro-restrictions, and now the fact that he had broken them would be a way to get rid of him, or at least to expose his hypocrisy. Ash, I want your take on this. Do you think this story adds up? Do you think that this was just a disgruntled staff member who, didn't have any particular connection to any of Matt Hancock's rivals, but just was upset or annoyed at Matt Hancock for being pro-coronavirus restrictions, and so of their own accord decided to leak this footage to national newspapers?
I think it's plausible, but then again, it's also plausible that there is a lot more access, high-level access to the CCTV footage in and around ministers' offices. And it's politically useful to make sure that that's on hand should any of those ministers step out of line. I just think that I want to be careful because I don't want to be out here saying completely wild stuff and, I've got absolutely no justification for it whatsoever. But thinking about how political parties and operations work, you don't have a machine which is powered by raging egos and narcissists working simply because of goodwill. One way in which whips work is by, carrots and sticks. Carrots of, if you play ball, you might get this nice little promotion at some point down the line. The stick is remember all this shit that you've done. And so I think that there must be quite a lot of ways in which to access CCTV footage, documentation, records, which mean that you've got a sort of sizable stash of wrongdoing to make sure that, MPs, junior ministers, senior ministers all stay in line. And how it is they access it, I don't know. I just don't think that anybody who works at the Department of Health, particularly if there's somebody who's got access to CCTV footage, would risk their jobs like that unless they were of a level of seniority, which meant that they were kind of comfortable doing so because they would enjoy some kind of protection.
It is weird. The story is really weird because for this argument to work, you don't just have to work in an office to see how many people get to see CCTV. So this is someone who was able to go into the CCTV room, scroll back, find the relevant part, and then they think, potentially filmed it on their camera phone. Now, really, you have to be in the security team to do that. And is the security team going to be the team who knows that Matt Hancock is copping off with one of his aides? Because as you know, the way that security cameras work is you're not looking at all the cameras at the same time. The cameras are essentially there so that if there was an incident, you can scroll back and see who it was who left the room with the computer or whatever. It's nearly always retrospective. There will be some sort of live monitoring, but you'll have one person looking at loads and loads of screens and it'll be flicking between the screens. So the idea that a security guard with no personal connection to these politicians would know this is somewhat implausible. The idea that there'd be anyone, just a disgruntled member of staff who would have found access to the CCTV, a disgruntled member of staff who does have a personal connection because maybe they're a junior advisor or whatever, how would they have got the image of the CCTV?
And also just something that I want to say very quickly. Do you think that Matt Hancock is the only one who's up to that kind of business? Like, do you? Because I obviously cannot put names to any of this stuff because I don't want to get sued. I don't have any assets to my name, but I don't want to lose my trainers or something. But in terms of open secrets in Westminster, right? These are not people who are known for their discretion or good judgment. All right. They're often very mediocre personalities who are completely high on their own sense of self-importance, self-regard, the attention and the power and all of that. And it makes them do stupid things like teenagers because they're like, oh my God, I am just pure libido right now. So I've heard about a senior politician who was overheard by their colleagues having sex in a bathroom. I've heard of another politician who probably should know better, but has sort of secretly moved out from the house they shared with their spouse, and has now, shacked up with somebody, a bit younger and a bit more attractive, despite being still married to the spouse that they were living with. These are things which everybody knows. And I doubt that any one of these people would be so diligent as to never, ever do anything anywhere near an office or a bit of the parliamentary estate where there's CCTV. All right. There's all sorts of stuff on camera, So why was this the bit of footage which has made it out? That's what I think. And I just think that, the idea that there is some, fairly low down security guard who's just really angry about lockdowns, and so that's the one thing that he's going to go for, it just doesn't stack up.
And I mean, the weirdest thing, because I take your arguments, it's helpful for, a whip, for example, to have some juice on ministers, so they might collect these images or whatever, and there will be other people who've been filmed doing this kind of thing. But everyone seems to agree that Matt Hancock is the only minister who had a CCTV camera in his office. It was also, visible to everyone, but Matt Hancock didn't notice it, and he's been in that office for years. Like, it's really, really odd. I want to go to a quote from Sajid Javid, and this was in the Times, because he's obviously now moved into that office, and there is a camera there which they've now
and he's
disabled.
Detoled that door, like he was in there with the
that's the first thing he did.
Antibacterial spray, being like, "Get that doorknob."
Let's go to his quote. So Javid said, "I haven't disabled the camera that you're talking about, but it has been disabled by the department. It's just common sense. I don't think as a general rule there should be cameras in the Secretary of State's office. I've never known that in the other 5 departments that I've run, and I'm not really sure why there was one here, but I'm sure there will be more to this as the whole incident is investigated." So they're saying, there was a CCTV camera there. Since this Matt Hancock video was revealed, they've turned it off. Apparently, they've sort of taped it with black masking tape now, in case that just to double check that it's off. But that Matt Hancock didn't notice it beforehand when it's clearly visible is just really odd, doesn't really stack up. Robert Peston, actually, from ITV, did a very interesting tweet today. He was expressing surprise at the apparent decision by the government not to investigate the leak. If there's anything more suspicious than the series of events we've seen, it's that the government doesn't seem to want to know what actually happened, or at least doesn't want to publicly investigate what has happened. So Peston tweets, "It's hard to think of a bigger security breach than the leaking of the Matt Hancock snog film." Oh God, the Matt Hancock snog film. "And yet Downing Street is saying that an internal Department of Health inquiry is all there'll be, and there is implication they'll never say what happened, even if they find out smells very rum." I mean, he's right, isn't it? There's clearly a security breach. The story doesn't quite stack up, but no one wants to work out what's happened. And it seems actually that even Matt Hancock doesn't really. I mean, maybe they got more dirt on him, so I suppose he wants to be in Boris Johnson's good books, and he's probably a bit like, you got me, well played. I don't want to cause any more of a fuss because I don't want to upset Boris Johnson, because ultimately he's going to give me another job in 6 months' time. Boris Johnson doesn't want whatever's happened to be uncovered. I mean, he's obviously very close to Rupert Murdoch. Potentially the son or that. As I say, it's very difficult to work out what has happened here. But the fact that the government doesn't want to investigate it is pretty goddamn suspicious. I want your final thoughts on this issue, Ash. I mean, in a way, we're being very speculative here because we don't have the information. But it does seem like this is an issue where all of the people actually who have power here don't want a definitive account of what happened to come out. Okay,
so charitable reading would be they don't want to make a big deal over how did the images see the light of day because, they caught him red-handed and it's better for, the government to just move on, right? That's the most generous reading of that. But the less generous reading of it is that, well, why would you want to find out exactly how those images were captured, how they were obtained, and how they eventually made it out of Whitehall? Because actually, if you're able to capture those kinds of images and use them for political assassinations, well, that might come in handy for you one day. So why would you want to close off that tap?
Well, it also might be that you think if you don't, agree to cover it up, then ultimately there's a video of you that will come out So is it that Boris Johnson wants to use similar footage in the future, or is it that if, completely speculative, if this was sort of like a deal between a newspaper editor and a private investigator or whatever, this is all highly speculative, that you wouldn't want to out them for that in case they had something on you. It could be that instead of politicians thinking we can take advantage of this situation, it's politicians who are too scared to uncover the actual situation because they're worried that someone else ultimately has power over them too.
Because I think that there's just all sorts of dirt around, all right? Because like I said, I just don't think that the kinds of people who go into politics are actually by their nature discreet and have got good judgment, all right? Raging narcissists, that's who occupies SW1. But I mean, really, of all the kinds of erotic, romantic, sensual places that you want to get it on, the Department of Health building, with that carpet? I don't know, Michael, how much snogging have you done in the Novara office?
Not much in the Novara office, but I will say that where I would choose to snog someone would often just be a matter of convenience. So if I was chirpsing someone in the Novara office, I'm sure I would have made out with them there.
Well, okay, I just want to know.
This is the one part of the story that I think makes sense.
But, it's just kind of, don't you find it suspicious that he already had it labelled a kiss door?
Yeah, it was called the kiss door.
Call it that. What do you
expect? The camera. Yeah, what do you expect? All right, we're getting too speculative. We're going to come back to this hopefully when there are some more details known. But I think our conclusion is the official story does not quite stack up here. We're going to move away from Matt Hancock and go to the very important issue of the current state of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's mixed. What's going on? In the last 24 hours, almost 23,000 COVID cases were reported across the UK. Now, for the exact figure, as you can see here, there were 22,868 cases reported. Obviously, that's probably a little bit higher than it would be because it's a Monday, so you get a bit of catch up because there's less reporting done on a Sunday. But the 7-day average is still very high. It's around 17,000 per day. And what's probably most significant here is that, as you can see, the 7-day case rates are a whopping 70% up on the previous week. Now, that is a really, really fast rate of increase. We're in proper exponential growth area here. This doesn't look good. And this rate of increase in cases this high, I mean, this is the kind of thing we haven't seen since January. Obviously, they ended up getting a lot higher then, 60,000. Many people predicting that if this current rate of increase continues, we could be, getting to numbers similar to that in the near future. Obviously, the reason it peaked at 60,000 was because a lockdown was implemented. That's not going to be implemented now. So you're seeing growth at this super, super steep rate, and we're seeing incredibly high figures. On one level, it's incredibly worrying, right? At the same time, as I say, it is a mixed picture because of the vaccine rollout having reached most of the vulnerable. Hospital admissions, they are rising. They've doubled since the start of May. So that's, again, sort of a worrying rate of increase, although not as fast as cases. But they are nowhere near the levels they were over the winter. So the cases, they're a third of what they were at the peak. Hospital admissions, nowhere near that whatsoever. So if you ignore the past couple of months where we've had really, really low rates of COVID, you have to go back to the 9th of September for hospitalization rates to be so low. So this is not particularly concerning. And this all, in conjunction, raises a very mixed picture. Cases are rocketing because of the vaccines. The one metric we're used to hearing about to determine whether or not new restrictions will be necessary, which is hospitalizations, they remain under control. So what should the policy response be to rising cases? Very, very difficult to say. And in terms of drawing out the tensions at play, there was a really, really interesting exchange on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday. Now, it was interesting because on the show, Andrew Marr revealed that though he is double vaccinated, he had recently caught COVID and become quite sick. He'd in fact missed an episode of his own show the previous weekend because of that. He thinks he caught it at the G7 in Cornwall. Now, Andrew Marr spoke about this experience to Sir Peter Horby, who's chair of NervTag. That's the group that advises SAGE on, in particular, respiratory viruses. So the kind of thing we're looking at with COVID-19. And Andrew Marr, I mean, essentially, it was an interesting conversation about what Andrew Marr should infer from his experience.
I hope it's not self-indulgent, Sir Peter, to ask you about me, because I got coronavirus last week. I'd been double jabbed earlier in the spring and felt, if not king of the world, at least almost entirely immune, and yet I got it. Was I just unlucky?
Were you unlucky? I think you were. I mean, what we know with the vaccines is that they are actually remarkably effective at preventing hospitalizations and deaths. They are less effective at preventing infection. So, although you were sick, you weren't hospitalized, and there wasn't any fatality. And that's probably because of the vaccination. I think it's really important for people to realize that as we increase the vaccination rates and most older people are vaccinated, we will see breakthrough infections, and we'll start to see that actually, in the end, the majority of infections are in people who've been vaccinated. And that does not mean that the vaccines don't work. Breakthroughs are expected. What we want to do is to prevent hospitalizations and deaths, and the vaccines do that very effectively.
Sure, I'm pretty clear that by being vaccinated, I did not end up in hospital, and that's a great thing. But we use slightly glibly occasionally this phrase, mild and moderate infections. For me, it was really, really quite unpleasant. And I just wonder if it's important in terms of public health messaging to explain to people, you may be double vaccinated, but that doesn't mean you won't catch COVID-19 and it won't be pretty bloody.
I think you're absolutely right. You can be pretty sick and not end up in hospital. And actually, many of my colleagues and friends have been in that situation. I'm in my 50s, and many of my friends of a similar age have had pretty severe illness and have been close to sort of trying to admit themselves to hospital. So you can get quite a nasty disease.
So, I mean, what was really interesting there is you had the expert, who's Peter Horby, who's looking at COVID from a macro perspective. He's saying the metric we use as to what's worrying is whether or not hospitals are soon going to be overwhelmed. At the same time, you have Andrew Marr say, I didn't go to hospital. It was pretty nasty, right? From an individual perspective, getting COVID yet not going to hospital is still not a particularly attractive proposition. So you've got the expert saying from a macro level, if you were a bit ill, sorry about that, but ultimately it's not the end of the world. Andrew Marr saying, but it did feel pretty awful. And it's likely that this is going to be a reality for a while, that people will keep getting sick, even if they've been double vaccinated. That's what's particularly worrying about it. Now, in terms of efficacy against the Delta variant, I've shown you these stats before, but I do think they are super, super important for understanding the position we are currently in when it comes to the effectiveness of these vaccines and what that means for our health and whether or not we're all going to get COVID-19, which is, to be honest, what I've been thinking about quite a lot over the past couple of weeks. So let's get this up. And there is a difference between Pfizer and AstraZeneca. So after one dose of the Pfizer vaccine, it is you are 36% less likely to get COVID-19. You are 94% less likely to end up in hospital. So it's super, super positive, amazingly effective, but you are quite likely, if you come into contact with it, to get COVID-19. I'm in that situation at the moment. Pfizer dose 2, it goes up to 88%. So by the time you've had 2 Pfizers, I'm pretty sure Moderna will be the same because they're the same technology, mRNA. You do have a significantly reduced chance of catching it, only a 12% chance. Obviously, not a 12% chance if you are in the situation to catch it. 12% of what it would have been were you not vaccinated. That's very high, and hospitalization super high, 96%. On AstraZeneca, which I presume is what Andrew Marr has had and what many older people in the country will have had, again, after one dose, it's not particularly effective against symptomatic disease, but far more effective against hospitalization. But what I think is probably most relevant here when we're thinking about the long term is that even after being fully vaccinated with an AstraZeneca jab, you still are only 67% protected against symptomatic disease. So there are going to be a lot of people all the way until potentially we have booster shots who are going to be at a decent risk of having Andrew Marr's experience, which is having fairly debilitating flu for a week or so, but then not ending up in hospital. And I think that is going to really bring about some difficult interesting public policy questions about how to deal with this. And I'm really not sure how the public will respond to this at large. It could easily be something that's quite divided according to age. I want to show you one more clip from that exchange, which I think actually complicates the matter even more. And that's because they also spoke about the changing symptoms for COVID. Let's take a look.
My early symptoms were simply like a summer cold, and I had no idea for a while that I had COVID-19 at all. I'm wondering whether the symptoms listed on the NHS website at the moment are out of date.
Well, it is being looked at. We monitor, there's various systems in the UK to monitoring the symptom clusters that we're seeing in people who are testing positive for COVID-19, and we update the symptom list. At the moment, there is some suggestion that the symptom profile might be slightly different, but not any evidence that's strong enough yet to change the case definitions and the recommendations.
And so why I think this combination presents, I suppose, some real challenges. We're in a situation where even if you're double vaccinated with the AstraZeneca jab, like Andrew Marr, you've got a significant chance of catching COVID-19 at the same time, which can be quite unpleasant, even if it's not going to end you up in hospital in nearly all cases. At the same time, anyone who has the symptoms of a cold could have COVID-19. Right. And you've got to think about this in terms of what's it going to mean for self-isolation, as it has been the case so far. If you get a continuous cough, if you get a flu, you have to self-isolate, which is a fairly awkward thing to do. If we have to do that every time we get a mild cold, and then if, at the moment we've got 22,000 people testing positive every day, that's a lot of people self-isolating. It's a lot of people who are self-isolating because they were contacts with someone who was positive. And at the same time, you're all going to be fairly worried that you're going to give COVID-19 to an older relative who's double vaccinated if you've just got the sniffles. And the whole thing, I think, I don't think this is a disaster. Clearly, the vaccines are working. We're not having hospitalizations increase dramatically to anything like what we've seen before. But this is a hell of a public policy problem.
Okay, so leaving aside long COVID for the minute, which I do think changes a lot, and you will get that data in, not in 3 weeks' time, but 3 months' time, 6 months' time, right? There is a lag for finding out what the impact of vaccines is going to be on that. But just taking it on terms of symptoms are potentially evolving with the Delta variant. So it's much more like the classic symptoms of a cold rather than the loss of smell and taste, dry continuous cough and the fever, which we all recognized almost straight away. Is that I think that it's tricky because vaccines, I think, encourage a sense of absolutism in people. They think, I am absolutely protected from this. And if someone else has it, it means they're absolutely protected too. And getting people to think in terms of relative risk and relative safety, right? How do you get somebody to understand what it means to be, 88% protected it is? Like, what does that mean, right? It's something where you go, okay, so what does that mean for my behaviors, especially when you've got senior figures in government saying, well, by the time we get to this date, when we hit this date, and it means that, X many percent of the population have had both their jabs, it means we can go full unlocking, no social distancing, no masks. Again, it discourages people from thinking, well, hang on, there are lots of moving parts here. So I think it's conceivable that some of the behavior changes that we have brought in because of coronavirus, like people not really shaking hands anymore or wearing masks on public transport, or even the idea of just taking your sick pay, taking time off because you're unwell. We've got one of the lowest sick day rates in Europe in this country. And that's not because people don't get sick, it's just because people always went to work. I think maybe those changes will stay with us, and perhaps will have to stay with us because, it's true, getting a horrible flu might not land you in hospital, but it fucking sucks. And you don't want that.
Yeah, but at the same time, we don't want to shut down society so we don't get a horrible flu. As you say, long COVID and the rates of that when it comes to vaccinations are going to be super crucial. So we'll come back to this story. For now, we are going to end tonight's show. Ash, it has been an absolute pleasure being joined by you on a Monday night, as always.
No, thank you for having me. I've got a chicken to get out the oven, so that's why I've been miming at Michael for the last 5 minutes. I'm like, that baby needs to be basted.
I'm sick of hearing about how sick Andrew Marr felt last weekend.
I'm sick of it.
I'm very glad you're better if you are watching, Andrew Marr. All right, let's end there. If you are a supporter of Novara Media, thank you so much. You make all of this possible. If not, please go to Novara Media novaramedia.com/support and consider donating the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. We really do appreciate it. It makes all of this possible. We'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.